go. We're in a teaching series on the 7 deadly sins. I mentioned to you that the defining personality traits of some of the Looney Tunes cartoon characters was modeled after one of the 7 deadly sins. Yosemite Sam, for example, obviously personified anger, and that's our topic for the morning. That's the reason for the opening clip. Yosemite Sam, back before TV was violent, right?
Yeah.
There are moments in my life when Yosemite Sam and I have had a lot in common. My anger can look like that. I mean, for example, about 2 weeks ago, the air conditioner went out in my house, right in the peak of how it was just miserable. It was miserable hot. You know how I responded? I said, this is the truth. I said, this is definitely a first world problem. I called a repairman, paid a little bit of money. The house was hot. I stayed cool. That's cool. But then last week, I was on the phone with an insurance salesman for the church. He was a condescending, just demeaning little prick. Bless his heart and the missionaries in Africa. And I found myself, I just went into that Yosemite Sam character really easy with him, and he hung up on me. And at that moment, I was reminded of a term that I have taught you before. The term is Amygdala hijack. And it's a term that was coined in Daniel Goleman's book, Emotional Intelligence. I have taught on the topic of anger numerous times, but professionally, I address the topic of anger continually in the counseling setting, and personally, yes, you know, I am very much a work in progress in managing my anger. So I think we can all relate to some degree, so I don't feel a need to justify repeating much of what I have taught you before. We have talked about amygdala hijack, an important concept. And so, the eyes send information to a region in our brain called the thalamus. And if the image is perceived to be a threat by the thalamus, it sends a message to the amygdala. The amygdala, that's the part of the brain that responds to, with an emotional response. The amygdala sends an alarm, and then this rush of sort of neurochemicals is released in our body, including adrenaline. It just floods the body system, and that rapid response is required or needed if a threat is interpreted as a threat. You know, it saves our life. But the amygdala, and this is what you need to understand, is also abandoned. When it receives a signal that is a perceived threat, it overrides the functioning of another part of our brain. It shuts off the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is that area that is responsible for sort of logical, rational thinking. It's the executive control center of the brain. It's the center of conscious thought. The prefrontal cortex, by the way, this helps understand its purpose. It's not fully developed in children, actually, until we're in our late 20s. And that's why young children can have those emotional meltdowns that seem so out of proportion. It's why teenagers might engage in some reckless behavior, which just sort of overrides any consideration for the potential consequences. And we go, what were they thinking? Well, they weren't using, or they don't have that area of their brain developed yet. So, back to this. There is a perceived threat, snake, and the logical region, or the logical rational function of the brain is overridden by the amygdala, because the amygdala sends 2 thoughts. It is fight or flight. Some say run or gun. That's the thought. It's survival mode. And that functioning of the brain makes all the sense in the world if there was a snake. Doesn't make much sense if you're stuck in a traffic jam and there's nothing you can do about it, or if you're talking to a jerky salesman who hangs up on you. It doesn't make sense. But understanding amygdala hijack helps explain why after an angry episode, we go, how could I have been so dumb? How could I have felt so out of control? Why did I act so illogically? There's the answer. It's very important to understand that when we try to devise a sort of an anger management strategy for ourselves. Because if that strategy, in the heat of the moment of anger, is too cognitive, it's not going to work. And what I mean by that is this. You're in the heat of the moment. You're so angry. It's not going to help if I say, you need to analyze your anger. What was the trigger event? Anger is a secondary emotion. What is the primary emotion underneath it? What was the message behind your emotion? What was the sequence of events that led up to this angry outburst? And I ask all of those questions in a counseling session, but in the heat of the moment when you are angry, that cognitive approach is not going to work. Why? Because the amygdala has been hijacked and the rational, logical part of our brain has shut down. Does that make sense? Does it not make sense to someone? And if it doesn't, are you angry right now? You can't have this overly cognitive approach to anger management. But we hear advice like, when angry, count 10. If you're really angry, count to 100. And actually, that's not bad advice because we are trying to re-engage the prefrontal cortex of our brain in anger. This verse makes sense of it. In Proverbs 14, whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. We'll do it again. Whoever is patient, and the parallelism in the Hebrew explains the meaning of patient. Patient is contrasted with quick-tempered. And so whoever is patient, meaning they don't lose their temper, they've got a slow response, has great understanding. Yes, because the amygdala hasn't hijacked the prefrontal cortex. But one who is quick-tempered displays folly. And now we know why. So the emotion of anger has the potential to tremendously impact our ability to make wise decisions. We make impulsive and destructive choices when the amygdala hijack happens. The ghost system hijacks the stop and think system, and the oh crap syndrome kicks in. That's how that process works. Now there's one more term. Cool background, Andy. Another interesting term is amygdala hijack hangover. This was so enlightening to me when I learned this. But the adrenaline and those other stress-released hormones into our body, when the amygdala sends that signal, and the body is just flooded with all these neurochemicals, they stay in your body for up to 4 hours. And you can experience the feelings of anger and rage long after the event. And you know what I'm talking about, don't you? It's just that yucky, it's that hangover feeling, and it is so detrimental to our health. All right. I did an 8-week series on anger. This is kind of the best market, jumping around the important pieces. There are several words in the Greek New Testament for anger, and 3 that are very important for us to examine. The first is this word, paragismos. It is suppressed or repressed anger. The word is found in Ephesians chapter 6. Okay. Fathers, do not exasperate paragismos your children. New American Standard, do not provoke your children to anger. So the word paragismos refers to anger that is forced to exist below the surface. Suppressed anger might be seething just below the surface, but it is suppressed anger. One of the fundamental truths about anger is this. Is there a phrase there? Anger always finds an avenue of expression. Everyone read that with me. Anger always finds an avenue of expression. It does. Sometimes people suppress their anger inside. Outwardly they will say, I'm not angry. But this person knows that they are angry, and they rehearse and they nurse that anger inside. We call this person the stewer. Okay? They just let their anger simmer and stew inside of them. But anger always finds an avenue of expression. And for the stewer, that anger gets expressed sideways. Passive-aggressive behavior, a critical spirit, gossiping, being demeaning, put-downs, sarcasm, avoiding questions, withholding affection, avoiding stating your opinion. What would you like to do? Oh, I don't care. Yeah, they're angry. Their anger is definitely finding an avenue of expression, but it's not a healthy one, not in terms of building or enhancing a relationship. It's expressed, but in a manipulative and punitive way. Now, sometimes we suppress our anger so far down inside of us that we deny that we are angry even to ourselves. This is now repressed anger. There is suppressed anger. That's the stewer. Now there's repressed anger. We'll call this person the stuffer. Now if you take anger out of the equation just for a moment with the stuffer, this is where the hard work of therapy begins. Because underneath that anger, there may be some very painful past emotions and painful experiences and abandonment and abuse and rejection and shame. But to avoid those feelings, this angry person has repressed all of those emotions. How do you repress that anger? Perhaps through alcohol and drugs. We use alcohol and drugs to change the way we feel. We try to avoid the pain and we try to seek some pleasure. Perhaps we stuff that anger through serial relationships. Because each relationship has this honeymoon period and where there's this oxytocin release in our body and it feels good. Maybe it's through even the rush of gambling or excessive shopping. But there is a bit of emotional rush with those, and it changes the way we feel. But anger always finds an avenue of expression, and so for the stuffer, that anger expresses itself through that behavior, but it really manifests itself as sort of mental illness, or sometimes psychosomatic illness, or ongoing relationship struggles, serial relationships, addictive behavior. All of that is to mask the pain. There's a new study found that suppressing your anger may triple your risk of having a heart attack. And we thought it was only those who rage who have experienced health effects, but it's not so. You do not want to be a steward. You do not want to be a stuffer. Now, try to recall that movie, Forrest Gump. I think it actually came out in 1980. Is that even possible? But in the storyline of Forrest Gump, Jenny, such a tormented soul. Jenny, terribly abused as a child by her father, and she turned that anger inward. Jenny just modeled all of that, drugs and alcohol and running and hiding and promiscuity and suicidal ideation. And then one day there's a scene in that film, it's so good. She's an adult, she returns to her childhood home, long since abandoned after the death of her father. she approaches the home, and the anger she had turned inward just suddenly erupts. You remember that scene? And she begins to just hurl rocks at that house as hard as she can, and she's screaming this sort of meltdown, and then she collapses into a heap on the road. Okay, you remember? And what did Forrest say? Forrest sat down beside her, and he said, "Sometimes there's just not enough rocks." That's a good line. Sometimes there's just not enough rocks. It's so true. And we need to find, Jenny, we need to find healthy avenues to express the emotion of anger. Sometimes there's just not enough rocks. By the way, Forrest was a pretty good therapist right at that moment. He didn't minimize her pain. He was very emotionally present. He was compassionate. And yet that statement just sort of opens the door to say, Jenny, do you understand? That expression of your anger is not the healthiest. Because actually there's never enough rocks. So that was paragismos. Move on to the second word. This one's a little easier to understand. This is the word thumos. And think thunder. This is explosive anger. The word is found in Galatians 5. Sometimes it's translated there as fits of rage. Sometimes it's rendered as outbursts of anger. Both are really good translations. But Galatians 5, and the context here is really important. The acts of the flesh are obvious. Okay? The acts of the flesh, meaning those character traits of a person, the ingrained thoughts, the ingrained habits and patterns of the unregenerate person. That's the acts of the flesh. The acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, and thumos, fits of rage. And that list, the acts of the flesh, is then contrasted with the fruit of the Spirit, which follows right after it. But in contrast to the acts of the flesh, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. I'm going to come back to that. Fits of rage, outburst of anger. We're going to call this person the spewer. We've had the stewer, we've had the stuffer, and now this is the spewer. The spewer is Yosemite Sam, and the spewer is described all over the Proverbs. Proverbs 29, it says, "Fools give full vent to their rage." Yes, that's a spewer. Anger always finds an avenue of expression, and you don't want to be on the receiving end of the spewer's expression of anger. They are rageaholics. Their anger is explosive and destructive. Okay? Paragismos, thumos, one more word. And the words aren't important. I just want you to know that we differentiate between types of anger. The last word is orge. Ephesians chapter 4. In your anger, your orge, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Again, all review for you guys. Some obvious sort of takeaways, observations here in those verses. And here's the first one. The emotion of anger is not sinful. The emotion of anger is not sinful. We experience emotions because God created us emotional beings. Emotions are never right or wrong. They are not good or bad. They are not moral or immoral. They are simply messengers from the front line. Sometimes we're given this sense that anger is bad. It's not true. The ideal is not no anger. The ideal in the Christian life is to be slow to anger. And that's the character trait of God. You will see that all the way through the Old Testament. God being described as compassionate and loving and slow to anger. And we are to emulate the character of God into our life. That's why when we get to James chapter 1, we'll read brothers and sisters, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So anger is the emotion itself. The emotion is amoral, not good or bad, not right or wrong. It's the expression of that emotion, and you'll catch me saying that, emphasizing that. There's the experience of the emotion, there's the expression of the emotion, and it's the expression of the emotion that so often becomes sinful for fallen people. Anger can manifest itself in unhealthy expressions of paragismas or thumas. You can stuff, you can be a stewer, or you can spew that rage. All unhealthy emotions of anger. And then just one last quick observation in this is learn to address your anger promptly. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. Avoid ruminating on that, that trigger event that produces this emotion of anger. Avoid the amygdala hijack hangover. It doesn't feel good. Don't allow Satan a foothold in your life by holding on to that grievance. All right. So just take a moment, everyone. I want you to see if you can't identify with one of those three. Which one do you most closely identify with? Are you a stewer, simmer and stew? Are you a stuffer, or are you a spewer? If you need some help, ask your husband or wife next to you. If it doesn't cause a fight, okay? Identify with that? Here we go. In order to address anger, I just mentioned this, we need to understand the difference between experiencing the emotion and expressing the emotion. We all experience the emotion of anger. We actually have very little control over the emotion we experience. But we must take complete responsibility for how we express that emotion. And the more we expand the time between our awareness that, boy, I'm experiencing the emotion of anger, and I choose to express that emotion, the more we can expand that time, the better. And for me, it's a nanosecond sometimes. But when you expand that time, you're allowing a moment to re-engage your prefrontal cortex. I'm going to make a different choice. So I try to do this little brief meditative mantra in my mind, and mantras are valuable when they're kept really short. Again, we're not going to do this big cognitive analytical process as we're sensing that we're becoming angry. And so it sounds simply like this. I'm not a spewer. I'm a showcase. That's it. I'm a showcase of the Spirit's working in my life to display the fruit of the Spirit, that Christ-like character, that transformation process that we are all in. I'm not a spewer, I'm a showcase. That's it. And at the same time, from past study, as you store up this stuff, in your heart and in your mind, your mantras become more meaningful, because when I say I am a showcase, I automatically think of at least two fruits of the Spirit that God is working into my life. The first one is the fruit of patience. I can't remember what I gave you here for slides, Randy, but patience, the word in the original language is makrothumia. You can figure this out. You're all Greek scholars. Macro, meaning long, as opposed to micro, short and little. Macrothumia, and you have learned the word thumas, explosive anger. Thumia is the word for temper. So patience means long-tempered, as opposed to having a short fuse. I'm a showcase of the Spirit. Patience, long fuse. Not quick to anger. And so in that mindfulness, sort of meditative breathing process, you just remind yourself that I'm a showcase of patience. I'm not a spewer. I'm long-tempered. And then there's one more word. You know this one as well. It's the word gentleness. The fruit of the Spirit is gentleness. And that word means strength under control. Used of wild animals as they were broken and tamed, powerful animal, and yet all that power was now channeled and useful. A powerful word picture. So we remind ourselves of there's our real strength. I'm a showcase of the Spirit of gentleness, strength under control. I'm not a spewer. I'm not. I'm a showcase. And I find that definition very helpful because emotions don't appear out of midair, right? Okay. There's a trigger event. Then we apply meaning to that event. We interpret the event. Everyone interprets it differently. But we personally interpret that trigger event. There's now a thought or belief in our mind. Beliefs inform our emotions. Our emotions put us in motion and produce a behavior. You want to change a behavior, you got to back up and change that belief that is there. So, now, one more, a little important. Emotions are messengers. Emotions should not be our masters. Everyone would say that. Emotions are messengers. Emotions should not be our masters. So, that emotion that I'm feeling, anger, it's simply a messenger. At some point, I need to work that emotion back and try to understand what is the belief, what is the thought that triggered that emotion. And then you have to do the work of, well, is that belief true or is that belief false? That interpretation of the trigger event. Because I can't change a behavior until I change my belief. There's a therapist, Michael Graham, who defines anger in terms of our expectations and our assumptions in the world. And he believes that anger almost always results when we are expecting an outcome to be different than it is. I expected it to be different. That's the belief. But there's even something a little more subtle behind it. It's, and I'm going to control it. I am going to control that outcome. And over again, we will sit with a couple in counseling, and let's say the woman is saying, I feel controlled by him. I know immediately this guy is struggling with anger issues. And I have to, in that process, be able to sort of gently tell him, that's the belief that you're supposed to control. And you can't control. You can't cheer. You can't control your partner. You can only choose how you're going to express that emotion of anger. Anger is not a bad emotion. It's a messenger from the front line. In fact, sometimes we'll say anger is an attempt at intimacy. Something that's important to you feels threatened or is not being met. You need to learn how to express that in a healthy way. And so here's this emotion from this belief that says, I'm supposed to control. And how's that working for you? It doesn't work very well in relationships. You can't cheer, you can't change, you can't control the other person. And when we begin to understand that, and we choose how to express that emotion, and in this case, I'm a showcase. I'm going to express that emotion through patience, macrothumia, long-tempered. I'm going to express it through gentleness, strength under control, my affect, my tone, all under control. It's just this sort of ironic, amazing thing begins to happen because you felt like everything was out of your control. But when you start to display gentleness and patience, you suddenly realize, I feel so in control. I feel so in control of myself. And there is a sense of peace and serenity, and all comes from that. All right. Well, we are definitely works in progress, are we not? And we need the Spirit's enabling to do that. 7 deadly sins. The goal is really not to study the sin. The goal is transformation. We want to become more Christ-like. So we try to cultivate those fruit of the Spirit. Gentleness, patience. Let's pray together. And you know what? Now I'm going to take a couple questions if anybody would have a question. The gracious Father, we do pray for your Spirit's working in our life in this regard, because anger can be such an unattractive trait in all of our lives. Rarely is our anger righteous anger as you displayed for us. And so we would echo James' instruction in making our prayer. Father, make us quick to listen, and slow to speak, and slow to become angry, and make our words as we speak filled with your wisdom, and may our words be backed up by a lifestyle that supports our words, a lifestyle that is honoring and glorifying to you. And again, we just recognize how desperately short we fall, so we ask for your Spirit's empowering.